Okay, well, we're in the book of Job, and we finished off last class by saying that we're now going to deal with a man by the name of Elihu. All of Job's three other friends have already spoken. They've already said their piece, and Job said his piece. And so by the time you get to chapter 32, well, let's start at the very last verse of chapter 31. 31 verse 40 says, "The words of Job are ended." In other words, Job said his piece, and we talked about how last week Job's friends, they made good points. Every time they spoke, they said things that were true, but they weren't true all the time. That was the problem. So when one of Job's friends would say, "The wicked suffer for their wickedness," that's true, but it's not always true. And it's not always true that the reason people suffer is because they're wicked. And so they kept bringing that up over and over and over again and poking at Job and poking and prodding him until Job began to overstep his bounds. And he began to say things that were wrong for him to say. He began to argue that if God would only give him a day in court, if God would let him argue his case, he could prove how he was right and God was wrong. How he didn't deserve this and God had made a bad decision or God had overlooked something. And when Job did that, when Job got to the point where he began to say that God, you don't know what you're doing in my case. You're right most of the time, but in my case, you forgot about me or you're mistreating me, whatever the case may be. That's when he stepped too far. So in all of his suffering and in all of Job's pain, he was right when he said, "I hurt." He was right when he said, "I just wish I were dead." He was right when he told his friends, "You are bad comforters." He was right when he told them that he hadn't done anything wrong. In everything, Job was right except for when he said, "God, you made a mistake." And I would like to argue that point with you. And so all of Job's friends, those three guys, got more and more frustrated with him. And their arguments got more and more ludicrous. And eventually, they've said their piece, they give up on him. You can just see him kind of wiping their hands and saying, "There's nothing more we can say to this man. He's not going to get it." And then we see in chapter 32 a man show up who we've never even heard his name before, Elihu. Now Elihu is the fourth friend. And so here, just read with me in chapter 32, the first several verses. It says, "So these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. And the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram, was aroused against Job. His wrath was aroused because he justified himself rather than God. Also, against his three friends his wrath was aroused because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Now because they were years older than he, Elihu had waited to speak to Job. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was aroused." So we see that Elihu, the reason we haven't heard about him is he's younger than these other guys and he's kept his peace the whole time. Now, we don't know whether he showed up partway through or whether he was there the whole time, but Elihu listened to these three older men argue with Job, and he too was upset with Job because Job was righteous in his own eyes. He justified himself rather than God, which is true, right? What was the one thing Job did wrong? "God, you made a mistake regards to me." So he justified himself rather than God. So Elihu was upset with him for that, but it says he was also upset with Job's friends because they didn't give Job a good answer and yet they still condemned Job, which we saw, right? We saw them say time and time again, "Job, you're wicked," and Job would say, "How am I wicked?" and they couldn't give him an answer, and yet they still condemned him, and Elihu was upset about that. So after everybody's done talking, Elihu's now going to speak. Now here's the problem with Elihu. Well, here, let's just look at a couple of things here before we go into what's good and bad about him. He's the youngest, as we talked about. Job 32 is going to be his rebuttal of Job's friends. As we go through, we'll look in chapter 32. He's going to spend the first part of it just telling Job's friends, you have made bad choices, you've not given wisdom. And you can see there, we're just kind of grabbing some of the highlights. When Elihu saw there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was aroused. So why was Elihu upset? These three guys spoke, but they had no answer. So I just want you to see where this man is coming from. So verse 12, he says, I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words. So this is why he was upset with these three guys. He says, I listened to everything that you guys said. I paid close attention. And not one of you convinced Job. So, and we see that ourselves. Those three guys spoke, and at the end, Job didn't tell them he agreed with them. So they didn't convince him. And they didn't give any answer to Job's rebuttals. Every time Job would say, yeah, but, I hear what you're saying, but you're wrong, they didn't give an answer. And so he was upset with them for that. And then in verse 14 it says, now he has not directed his words against me, so I will not answer him with your words. Now, what that means there in verse 14 is Elihu is saying, I'm going to talk to Job, but I'm not going to say what you guys said. Essentially, another way of putting this statement over here in verse 14 is he turns to those three guys and said, look, now Job hasn't used his arguments with me, so I'm not going to use your arguments with him. So Elihu, before he says anything to Job, you know something. At least in Elihu's mind, he has different arguments to give than these three men. Did everybody get that? Anybody have any questions on that so far? Okay. Now, here's the problem with Elihu. And I'm going to just be totally honest with you because, well, that's typically the best way to handle things. There's debate over whether Elihu is a good guy or a bad guy. So I'm going to give you the evidence for both. I'll give you the arguments for why he's good. I'll give you the arguments for why he's bad, and then I'll tell you my conclusion, but understand that's just my conclusion, and if you think differently, that's just fine. God gave you a brain to study the Bible on your own. I never want you to just take what I say anyways. But I'll just try and lay both arguments out, because the reason this argument comes up is we're going to listen to 32, 33, 34, 35, and 36, and 37. 6 chapters. 6 chapters this guy's going to speak. And he's going to talk and talk and talk and talk. And when he's done talking, we never hear anything one way or the other about him. Job doesn't talk to him because the next person to talk after Elihu is going to be God. So Job never rebuts him. So you never hear Job saying you're wrong. So you don't get to hear Job's thoughts on it. God doesn't specifically address what Elihu says, so you don't get God's perspective on this guy. He's just part of the narrative. And so as you read through, you are left to make the decision on your own. Is what this guy is saying, is it right or is it wrong? So you don't have any definitive thing that tells you whether Elihu is a good guy or bad guy. So I'm going to just give you the evidence on both sides and let you make the decision on your own. Evidence that he's good. He reprimands the other 3 men. Well, that's a good thing, right? There's one thing we do know. These 3 guys are wrong. We know it because their arguments are flawed. We've heard it all the way through. And at the end, God is going to condemn these 3 men for saying the wrong thing. So Elihu reprimands these 3 men, which is a good thing. So that goes down as something positive on his count. He's at least partially right about Job. One of the things that he's going to talk about with Job is that Job justifies himself rather than God. Well, remember how he started out the class. What was the one thing Job did wrong? He overstepped his bounds and said, I'm right and God is wrong in my case. And so he's going to condemn Job for that, and he's right to do that. So that's another thing that he has going for him. In chapter 33, verse 11, now this isn't the only place he says it, but it's a big place. He's going to mention something about suffering that none of the other men mention. And it's something that is right. Now look over in 33, verse 11. Excuse me, it's 34:11. I've got that mistyped there. 34:11. In 34, verse 11, he's been talking about suffering and talking about God and how God repays men for the lives they lead. And in verse 11 it says, "For he repays man according to his work and makes man to find a reward according to his way." Now that's a very big statement. And really, if there's nothing else you get from Elihu other than that one verse in 34:11, that's the big deal. Because what he's saying there is, God does reward everybody according to their work. He rewards the wicked, and He rewards the righteous. But God does it according to His own way. Now that's different than what the other three guys have said. If you have somebody who lives a very righteous life, you have David. David was a godly man, wasn't he? David was a man after God's own heart. How did David spend a good portion of his life? Running away from Saul, hiding in a cave over here, then running to another cave over there, and then here and there, constantly afflicted. You read through the Psalms, of which David wrote a good portion of them, and you see over and over again David saying, "Death encompasses me. I am snared, I am scared, I am terrified, I am on the brink of death." Now, David was a righteous man, and God repaid David according to his righteousness. But God did it in His own way. Now, you and I look at the rest of David's story, and was David a blessed man? Yeah, David was a blessed man. Did the Lord take care of David? Yes. Did He do it the way you would have taken care of David? No. So God repaid David for being righteous according to His own way. He had a different plan for David than you and I would have. So Elihu makes this argument that suffering is sometimes part of God's plan even for the righteous. Now, take what you know about the New Testament teachings on suffering, and is that correct? That matches your Bible, doesn't it? So Elihu, that's something in his good category, is when he talks about suffering, he says, yes, wicked people suffer for being wicked, but God sometimes repays righteous people for being righteous in odd ways. And that's true. And you look at someone like Paul, and Paul was a righteous man, and what did he get for living a righteous life? What did he tell those Corinthians he got? Shipwrecks, hunger, stonings, beatings. But then at the end of Paul's life, what did he say? I've run the course, I've run the race, and there is waiting for me an imperishable crown. So if you ask Paul, have you been rewarded for living a faithful life? Paul would say yes, but God did it in His own way. So Elihu's the first one to bring this argument up. And so that puts a point in his category, doesn't it? You have to say, oh, that guy brought up something none of the other ones did as far as suffering goes. Now, another thing he had going for him is the end of Elihu's arguments, when you get to chapter 37. So you get all the way over to chapter 37. The last chapter, he's going to spend a lot of time talking about how God made the creation. Look here, let's just start in verse 1. Just give you some of the flavor of it. It says, "At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Hear attentively the thunder of His voice and the rumbling that comes from His mouth. He sends it forth under the whole heaven, His lightning to the ends of the earth. After it a voice roars. He thunders with majestic voice, and He does not restrain them when His voice is heard. God thunders marvelously with His voice. He does great things which we cannot comprehend. For He says to the snow, fall on the earth. Likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of His strength. He seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work. The beasts go into dens and remain in their lairs. From the chamber of the south comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds of the north. By the breath of God ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen. Now, the rest of that chapter is him just talking about, now look at this creation. There's snow, and there's rain, and there's animals, and all of it works together just perfectly. And the whole point of chapter 37 is he's saying God does things we can't comprehend. Now, this is a point in Elihu's favor, because when God starts talking in the very next chapter, God's going to start talking about all the creation and about how He knows what He's doing. And He sets the boundaries for the water, and He takes care of the horse, and He takes care of the donkey, and all of these different things. And his argument, Elihu's final argument, sounds a lot like God's first argument. And it transitions very smoothly. And so one statement that people make is, well, really, when God starts talking, it's almost like He's saying, listen to this guy, see what he's saying's right. So that's one point in his favor, is at least the end of his argument sounds a lot like what God says, and we know God's right. So does that make sense? Anybody have any questions so far? Okay, last thing he has in the good category is, in chapter 42, God is going to condemn Job's 3 friends. And He's going to talk about those 3. Well, Elihu isn't mentioned in that, which tends to make you lean towards God wasn't upset with Elihu. He was upset with these 3, but He wasn't upset with him. And so it's just another indicator that kind of leans you towards Elihu was a good guy, and what he was saying was at least generally right. Anybody have any questions before we move to the bad stuff? Okay, here's the evidence for the bad. He loses his temper with Job. This is one of the things that's said. Chapter 32, if you look there in chapter 32, down in verse 17, he says, I also will answer my part. I too will declare my opinion, for I am full of words. The spirit within me compels me. Indeed, my belly is like wine that has no vent. It is ready to burst like new wineskins. I will speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. Let me not, I pray, show partiality to anyone, nor let me flatter any man. For I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. Now, some people, and once again, as you read through this, I'm trying to give you all the evidence. You look at that, and that's not the only time, but that's a good example of it. When he's going to talk to Job, when he says, I must open my mouth. I must vent my feelings. That kind of tells you how he's going to talk, doesn't it? He's going to hit it with a hammer. Well, one of the things that we've condemned these 3 guys already for is what? No sense of comfort for Job. So these 3 guys have had a bad attitude, a bad way of treating Job. They've mistreated, they haven't been comforters to him. And so one thing that is in the bad category is it seems like this guy's doing the same thing. He's using that same firm hand where what's Job been crying for the whole time? Be easy on me. Take it easy. Be nice. I'm hurting here. Another thing is, he says sarcastically that he will be Job's spokesman. Now, look over here in 33 verse 5. If you can answer me, set your words in order before me, take your stand. Truly, I am as your spokesman before God. I also have been formed out of clay. Surely no fear of me will terrify you, nor will my hand be heavy on you. One argument is here this guy in his anger, his frustration with Job, oversteps his bounds and says, oh yeah, I'll be the one who mediates for God. You talk to me, Job. I'll answer you. Which, that doesn't sound too good, does it? So there's a problem there. And so you say, okay, I'm not so sure I like that. And so that's one of those things that you see as you read through Elihu's argument is this, oh, edge to him. And he says things that you just kind of make you wince a little bit. Many of the things he says sound very arrogant. Look in chapter 36. Chapter 36, down in verse 4, he says, "For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you." Now, what did he just say? Hey, I know everything. One who's perfect in knowledge. I know what I'm talking about, buddy. So there's that there, okay? So as you go through it, you begin to look at it, and here's my conclusion on it. Now, you just take it and you do what you want with it, but my personal conclusion is that Elihu is closer to the truth than the other three. What he says, if you look at what he says, I like what he says a whole lot more than those other three guys. But the way he talks is very similar to how those three guys talked. And so I don't put him down as either the good guy or the bad guy. I don't think it's as black and white as that. I really don't. I don't think it's a matter of everything he says is right or everything he says is wrong. The exact same way as I feel about Job. Now you tell me, does everything Job say right or does everything Job say wrong? You say it's neither one, Scott. It's something in between. That's the way I feel about Elihu. What he says is for the most part correct, but the way he says it is for the most part incorrect. And so that's my personal opinion on it when I look at the two sides of the thing. Anybody have any questions or comments before we move forward? Okay. Now, having said all of that, we just covered all the way through chapter 37. We're not going to read every little bit of this guy's argument, because when you read chapter 34, verse 11, you got the most important part of his argument down. The most important thing that Elihu said of all the things he says is God has wisdom you can't comprehend, and He rewards people the way He sees fit. So sometimes you're going to be hurting and saying, "Why me, God? Why me?" And He has a plan you're just not aware of. And so really, that's the whole thrust of everything that Elihu says. Okay, now we get into chapter 38. Now's where things get good. Because for once, in the whole book of Job, we get to say something is black and white. Because we're going to hear God speak. So finally, I get to tell you, everything we read in the next part is right. Because with Job, I couldn't do that. Most of what Job says is right, but Job's friends said some things that were right, but here in chapter 38, we can now just say, write it down, God's going to answer the problem. And He's going to answer it in a very unique way. As God talks with Job, He's going to tell him some things and mention some things, and no single word is going to cover it. But when you look at the whole picture, you go, oh, I get what God's saying. So let's start in chapter 38. It says, "The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said." So first of all, how does God approach Job? There's a whirlwind. Some versions say a tempest. So there's a big whoosh. Just, something scary, a tornado, however you want to call it. And so here's God out of the whirlwind, and it's the same as when He talks on Mount Sinai. Remember on Mount Sinai, when God spoke to the children of Israel, there was fire and there was earthquakes and everybody was scared. That's what this is. This is a whirlwind, a scaring thing. And so God says, "Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." Now you just stop for 1 second. What's going to happen? What's Job been saying this whole time? If God had let me talk to him, I could prove my point. I got some questions for him. And God's going to start His thing by saying, "Job, I've got some questions for you." It reminds me a lot of when Jesus was questioned by the Pharisees, and He said, "Answer me one question, and then I'll answer you." And He asked about John the Baptist. That's what God's doing. He's saying, "Job, if you can answer what I'm going to ask you, then we can talk as equals. But until you can do that, you just be quiet. Because you're darkening counsel without knowledge. You don't know what it is that you're discussing. And so then he's going to list a whole bunch of things. He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Well, where was he? Job there? No. See, we're going to get all these rhetorical questions. They're all question after question after question, because God says, I'm going to question you, Job. But every single one of them you know the answer to. I don't know. I don't know. And that's what every single one of them is going to be. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So here, in the creation, when the creation happened, Job, where were you? Only the one thing you know, he wasn't there. So who decided the measurements? God did. Who laid the cornerstones? God did. Who put everything in place? God did. So you look at the world around you and how it works and how it functions and all of the detail of it, and you ask yourself, could I do that? If somebody told me, I want you to make a universe, could I do it? There's no way. And then he goes on to list various things. One of the things he's going to talk about is down in verse 8. He'll talk about shutting in the sea with doors. It says, or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band? When I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, and when I said, this far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. Now here's God, and we know today that what decides the tides is the moon, right? We know that. Our science has taught us that. But here it is. That moon has to be at just the right spot for it to work. And if it's too close, guess what happens to the tides? Well, they just overwhelm us. When the tide comes in, it's a tsunami. When the tide goes out, it washes all civilization away. And so he says, where were you, Job, when I set the moon at just the right distance away so that the tides would be there but not go too far? When I set the limits for it and said, you can't go any farther than this. And the other thing is true, if the moon was too far away and you didn't have the tides, the water would stagnate and all that rich sea life that we know of in the very beginning part of the ocean, all the beautiful coral reefs that you can see pictures of, those would all cease to be if there were no tides. The tide is the lifeblood of the ocean. And so here's God, and He takes that moon, first of all, who thought to use a moon to set the tides in the first place. I mean, just think about that. Everything about this is inconceivable, isn't it? Everything about what God is telling Job is just so beyond our comprehension. And so God says, I set those bars, I set that door, and I said, go no farther. And if we tell the tides to stop going somewhere, do they listen? What happened in New Orleans? What happens when an earthquake occurs and there's a tsunami? Can we stop it? We can hope we can protect ourselves from it, but you can't set the bars. Only God can do that. Next thing he'll talk about the circuit of the sun. He says, verse 12, if you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it. It takes on form like clay under a seal and stands out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld and the upraised arm is broken. So here he talks about, he says, here's the sun. And you tell me, did you set the sun so that it would rise at just the right time every day? And so that dawn would come at just the right moment, but not stay too long? Think about what would happen to our world if all of a sudden the dawn, Well, let's just say tomorrow the dawn didn't happen for us. There was no dawn. The sun didn't come up for us. What would happen to our side of the planet if that occurred for any length of time? It'd just freeze. And while our side was freezing, what would happen over in Australia? It'd burn up. So here's God, and He sets it, and He sets not only the day to happen at the right time, but He sets the earth on a tilt. So we have seasons. Well, you think about that. We need those seasons. I kind of like the summer one to show up. You know, we're waiting for those seasons here in Washington, and we miss them. And our plants get all befuddled up if they don't get them. And so here's God, and He's just laying one after the other. I just want you to get this sense of just boom, boom, boom. And every single one of these things is so incomprehensible. If we wanted to change the seasons, could we change that axis? I mean, could we move this earth so that it changed? And if we did, would it be better? It's just an unbelievable thing what the Lord does. You can look, and then He's going to talk about death. That is, what happens after this world when we fly away. He says, verse 17, have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Now, this is something that with all our scientific knowledge we struggle with still. What happens after death? You show me one human being who's been there. One human being who can explain to you what heaven will be like in any sort of comprehensible way. There's none of us. Now I can tell you what the Bible says, because God knows. God knows about the gates of death. He knows about the shadow. He knows what happens afterwards. But I can only tell you what He's told me. I can't tell you from experience. I don't know anything about death. And the only people who do know something about death never get a chance to tell us about it. So here it is. God says, Job, you tell me. I'd like to talk to you about death. I'd like to talk to you about the gates of death. Let's have a discussion here, Job, about what happens after you die. You tell me what you know, and I'll tell you what I know, and we'll see who knows more. Who's going to speak more in that conversation? See, you're just left dumbstruck. It's disturbing to me when I really start dwelling about how much more God knows than me. Not because He knows so much more, and that's a problem. That's a good thing. I'm glad He's so much wiser than me. But it's disturbing to think about how little we do know, isn't it? Just think about anything you imagine, anything you want to talk about, any subject there is, you know compared to what God does. He mentions with lightning. He says, let's see here, where's that one down? Down in verse 25. Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt? Now, verse 25 is kind of an interesting one, because we found out through science today that there is a path for the thunderbolt. They call them streamers. Now that picture I have up there is of streamers. Do you see how there's light coming down and there's light going up? Do you see how that is? Well, they're streamers, and they still don't know exactly how they work. They've got some good guesses and whatnot, but before lightning strikes, there is a streamer that comes down and matches up with electromagnetic forces from down below, and it creates that connection, right? You think about every electrical situation you have, it has to have a connection, right? So in order for that light bulb to come on, there has to be a circuit. Now, I'm dumbing it down, not for you, I'm dumbing it down for me. But there's got to be a circuit. So how's that circuit happen with lightning? God makes a path. And you don't even see that path. It's stop motion, that real fast photography that gives you those streamers. But here he says, who made the path for the thunderbolt? Me? I wouldn't even thought it needed one. Wouldn't even cross my mind. You go and you continue down, and he's going to talk about wildlife. Look down and verse 26, we'll start there and we'll read part of that, and then further down it says, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man. Now, who takes care of the areas of the world where there's no people to take care of it? Nobody to irrigate the land, nobody to take care of all the animals, to satisfy the desolate waste and cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass. Has the rain a father, who has begotten the drops of dew, from whose womb comes the ice and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? Look down in verse 39. Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens, or lurk in their lairs to lie in wait? Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food? Now, we know the answer to that. Who provides for the birds? God says, I do. You turn to the New Testament, it says, God provides for them. Christ himself says he provides for the grass, and he takes a flower and he clothes it beautifully, more beautifully than Solomon ever wore. He cares for 2 sparrows, and not a single one drops without him knowing about it. Now, I have up here a picture of a food chain. Now, this is the kind of thing that you'll get in school. This is the kind of thing when I was working at the zoo, this is what we would have school children come in, and this is what I'd teach them. A marine food chain. So you'd say, okay, now you have a big old whale over here. And the big whale eats fish, big fish. And then the big fish, he eats small fish. And the small fish eats zooplankton. And then the zooplankton eats the phytoplankton. And that's how the ocean works. That's how the whole thing's put together. That's how we would explain it. Now, God, that's what he's talking about. Who provides food for the lion? Who takes care of the raven and its little hungry young ones? Well, who made that food chain? Well, first of all, that's the food chain that I would use if I was teaching a bunch of elementary school students. This is an actual food web for one animal. This is what it really looks like. I'm not kidding, that's a real one. That's for cod, Pacific Northwest. If you want to look at cod, that's a food chain for that one animal. To the best of our knowledge. That's little kid stuff. That's what God makes happen for every single animal on the planet day in and day out. All that interconnection. And they'll tell you. Now, the reason this chart was put up there is because they were realizing they had started to get rid of one animal, and they thought it wasn't a big deal because they were thinking like, we teach little kids. Well, that animal's not in the food chain, so no big deal. Well, they got rid of that one animal, and it messed up the whole thing. And all of a sudden, the fishermen getting upset. There weren't enough fish, and everything was just a mess. Well, some guys started to map the connections. Those things are connected so carefully that if you take even one animal out of it, it just changes everything. And yet, day in and day out, who provides the lion with food? And the young'uns of the raven with food? Blows your mind, doesn't it? I just can't fathom what God does. And like I said, that's one animal. One animal. And he has just millions out there that he's taking care of and watching over. And so, once again, we're just left as God explains these things to Job. And I have no doubt we know more about this stuff scientifically than Job did. But the problem is knowing more, we still look at it and we have to say the same thing as Job, which is, I don't know what I'm talking about, God. Mountain goat, that's a real picture. He's licking mineral salt off of that rock. He stayed there. The guy stayed and watched him, the cameraman, for 6 hours. He finally left because he got tired of waiting for that mountain goat to climb down. He said, I never saw him go down. I just got tired of waiting. Okay, that's a mountain goat. Well, God says of the mountain goats, he says, chapter 39, verse 1, do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bear young? Now here's a mountain goat. Up in no man's land. Up where nobody goes. And yet, in this treacherous territory, where I think I sprained something just looking at that picture. You know, here these animals live, and they have young, and those young don't fall off the cliffs. You don't see baby mountain goats just going, oh! It doesn't happen. They live over and over and over again. Why? God. One of the great frustrations that evolutionists have is they have no idea where instinct comes from. How is it that you have these animals and they're born and they're not taught anything and they can climb? How? God puts that in there. Where? Was it in the genes? I don't know. That's my problem. I don't know. And all I can say is God knows what He's doing, and I don't. He's going to talk about the ostrich. Now, those are ostrich eggs there, and look down in verse 13. It says, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly stork's? For she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain, without concern. Because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. Here's this ostrich, and I have this picture here, and you see that guy right over there, and he just picks one up. Well, where's the ostrich? Gone. See, they don't have. One of the biggest problems they have with ostrich eggs is poaching them, because they're really easy to poach. You just walk up and pick it up and walk away. The ostrich, they don't hang around for very long. They don't care about their eggs. That's what God's saying here is that ostrich lays its eggs, and any predator knows an egg is an easy meal. And yet, there are still ostriches. Now, how is that? How is that you could have an animal as dumb as an ostrich, and yet they still have baby ostriches, and they still continue to reproduce, even though it would be the same as us. As soon as a baby is born, we just set it out on the front doorstep in the middle of winter. That's exactly what an ostrich does. How many babies would make it that way? That's what an ostrich does. And yet, like I said, they're still ostriches. They're not extinct. God says, I deprived them of wisdom, but I still take care of them. Just as you go through this, all I want you to see is just one thing. God knows what He's doing, and we know nothing. We're just a bunch of imbeciles. Next thing, in chapter 39, you're going to talk about the horse, the war horse. It says, verse 19, have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. Now he's talking about not just any old horse, but he's talking about that war horse, the horses that they would use for battle. And everybody knew when you see somebody with a horse, a war horse coming in battle, you're impressed and you're scared. Because he says, can you frighten him like a locust? Nothing will scare those horses. Those horses aren't terrified of anything. They go right into the sword, right into the battle. And no fear, no terror at all. Now his whole point with that is, here's a horse, and I have made a horse so that it has no terror whatsoever. It has total strength, and yet I made it, so who's stronger, the horse or me? So his point there is just simply, I'm the great God. And then the last thing we'll look at, and then we'll stop there, is we'll look at the eagle. You look at the eagle, and he says, verse 26, now he says hawk, but you could use this for any bird of prey. I just use eagle because we're familiar with them. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command and make its nest on high? On the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock and the stronghold, for there it spies out the prey, its eye observes from afar. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. And here, you have this eagle, and it makes a nest in a tree, and eagle nests, they get up to be as much as a ton. 1 ton. Now let me ask you, if you had to make something that weighed 1 ton and put it in a tree, what would be the chances you'd break the tree? I'd break the tree. and yet they do it every time, over and over and over again. They build these gigantic nests, and they have their young, and they spy their prey from afar, have their eagle eye. Eagles have these eyes that are tubular in shape, and they can see vast distances, miles. They can see just a little flicker of color from a fish under the water. And so here's God, and all the way through chapter 39, what's his point? I am great, and I know what I'm doing. We'll stop there. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
Quick question. Going back into chapter 36, verse 27 and 28.
Okay.
Where this is Elihu who's talking about the water vapor cycle. And I'm just curious where he got that knowledge from.
Yeah, that's a good question. See, and there would be another thing that you could almost add in there, because we know that nobody knew about the water vapor cycle, as far as we know, till way later. So some argument could be said, hey, this guy was speaking divinely even. So yeah, it's a good point. That's a question in there. Does everybody kind of get that? He said something about science that kind of makes us scratch our head, because he said nobody knew about the water vapor cycle till later. So it either means they knew it and then we forgot it, which sometimes happens, or it means that he was given some sort of divine wisdom somewhere in there. So yeah. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, we'll shut down there.